Hi there, this is Eshu. I'm the abbot here at Zenwest Buddhist Society. This Living Zen-podcast is just one of the many resources we've created at Zenwest to make Zen practice and training more available and accessible to people all over the world. Instructional videos, printable resources, and much, much more are also available on our website at www.zenwest.ca. If you're a regular listener, I'd love to hear from you. So please drop me an email at office@zenwest.ca and let me know who you are, how you got started, and what brought you to Zen. Everything we make available in person and online at Zenwest is only possible because of the support of our members and associates, people like you. If the efforts of our community are making a difference in your life, I'd like to invite you to show your support and take part in making it happen by becoming an associate or member of the Zenwest Sangha. You can do this by clicking the Join Us tab on our website at www.zenwest.ca. Thank you for your support, and thanks for listening. Continuing our exploration of the gateless barrier, Case 22, Mahakasyapa's Flagpole. Ananda asked Mahakasyapa, "The world-honored one transmitted the robe of gold brocade to you. What else did he transmit to you?" Kasyapa said, "Ananda!" Ananda answered, "Yes." Kasyapa said, "Knock down the flagpole at the gate." Wumen says, if you can give a turning word that is intimate to this case, then you will see that the meeting at Mount Gudrakuta is still vigorously in session. If you cannot, then Vipassana Buddha, who has been striving from earliest times, has not yet attained true subtlety. Wumen's verse says, "The call is good, the answer is intimate. How many discuss this with glaring eyes? Elder brother calls, younger brother answers, the family disgrace. There is a spring that does not belong to yin and yang." So last week during the intensive, I started this teisho. I started to give a talk about this particular case, but some other stuff came up, and I wanted to follow that and talk about that a little bit. So I didn't want to leave this case alone, so I thought I would come back to it, because it addresses something that is spoken about a lot, particularly in the Zen school, in Buddhism generally, but particularly in the Zen school. And it's something that's caused a lot of trouble in North America. But as we investigate these cases, we can see that even the fact that these cases are in the gateless barrier, even the fact that these interactions were talked about even from the time of the Buddha, we see that this issue that's brought up, transmission, has been problematic since the very first transmission. So before I get into case 22, I want to go back to case 6, is it? 5 or 6? Because there's some continuity, or there's a connection. The present case, 22, Mahakasyapa's Flagpole, involves Mahakasyapa and Ananda, two disciples of the Buddha. Mahakasyapa was a contemporary, some say maybe even a little bit older, of Siddhartha, Shakyamuni, the historical Buddha. And he was the first transmitted heir, I guess you could say, using the terminology of the Zen school. of the historical Buddha. The Buddha had two other major disciples, Shariputra and Moggallana, and they were the primary disciples of the Buddha throughout his life, but they both predeceased the Buddha, and so he didn't transmit to them. He transmitted to Mahakasyapa. Maha means great, and he was called the Mahakasyapa not because he was like just so super awesome, but actually there were 3 Kasyapa brothers, and so he was the eldest, the most senior of them, and so it's sort of like saying, the big Kasyapa. So Kasyapa, Mahakasyapa, was an early disciple of the Buddha, and he was no stranger to spiritual practice by any means. And it's one of the most fascinating periods of the sort of story of the development of the Sangha is the Buddha's encounter with the Kasyapa brothers. He had just a small following, and by small I mean 30 or 40 people at the time. And he came across this fire cult, basically a Brahmin fire sect by a river. Apparently, I think there was like 500 people or something in this sect, and their leader was Mahakasyapa. And his 2 other brothers also led sort of chapters of the fire cult that went down the river further. And so there's a wonderful story about the Buddha interacting with Mahakasyapa, having Dharma combat with him about the various merits of fire and elements. And as is a repetitive sort of case in the sort of Buddhist scripture, the Buddha encounters many such people, many such spiritual teachers and leaders, engages them in debate and Dharma combat, and they're so impressed with him that there's a rapid conversion. And so it's like, not only do they think, wow, that guy's really smart, they think, wow, that guy's really got it. So much so, and so much is his philosophy sort of consistent with his bearing and presence, that I'm going to drop this and just follow him. And so the story it's really, I love it. Is that these fire cultists, they all had like big dready hair. They were ascetics, so they meditated a lot. They maintained this fire, and aside from the debate, actually, there was this whole interaction with a snake who lived in this temple that they supported with the fire, and the Buddha slept in the temple, and the snake didn't eat him. So they were all really impressed by this. And so these ascetics were really sort of like, they maintained the fire, so you can imagine they were sort of sooty, and they had this long dready hair, and so after some time of debate and experiencing Siddhartha Shakyamuni and his disciples, Mahakasyapa says, I'm going to follow Shakyamuni. And so all of Mahakasyapa's disciples said, yeah, me too. So suddenly the population of the Buddha's Sangha increased many-fold. And the story is that there was this massive sort of conversion ceremony and ritual. And of course, becoming ordained in the Buddhist Sangha meant that you shave your head and you take on the patchwork robe. And so they shaved their heads, and they took all the hair and they threw it into the river. And of course the river washed the hair downstream to where the next eldest, Kasyapa brothers' disciples, found all this hair and thought, oh my God, there's been some kind of a massacre or some horrible tragedy has befallen the Mahakasyapa and his community. And so they quickly traveled upstream to find Mahakasyapa's fine, but he shaved off all his hair, and they're talking about this Buddha, this Shakyamuni. And of course, the sort of process repeats itself until the second brother, I think he has 300 disciples, and the third brother has 150 disciples. So this is the case. And there's many cases where Mahakasyapa, who is relatively new into the community, is given a seat. He's allowed to share the Buddha's seat. And so what we can acknowledge, and the sort of one of the things that is not spoken about so much certainly not in the scripture, but I think it's important for us to understand is, yes, Mahakasyapa had a significant amount of insight already, but he also clearly had a significant amount of charisma, and he certainly had a certain amount of organizational and leadership skill that was not theoretical. He had been running this organization of this community of practitioners for some time, and he was clearly better than his two brothers at it. So when we see Mahakasyapa interacting with the Buddha is talking to somebody who has ample skill in the leadership of the community. So the Buddha, I'm going to go back to case 6, called The Buddha Presents the Flower. Hopefully some of you were here when I spoke about this. Otherwise, the talk is on the podcast, and you're free to go and check it out. When the world-honored one, that's Shakyamuni, was at Mount Gurdrakuta. This is a famous mountain in India, in Nepal. Well, it's in like the Himalayas, southern Himalayas. The word translates as vulture peak, and it's apparently because the sort of top of the mountain kind of looks like a vulture's head. He presented a flower before the assembly, and everybody was silent. But Mahakasyapa smiled broadly. The Buddha said, "I have manifested the true Dharma I, the marvelous mind of nirvana, reality itself as simultaneously form and formlessness, and the subtle Dharma which can never be realized by relying on words alone and is transmitted without dependence on scripture or doctrine. Mahakasyapa has manifested this also." So in the Zen school, this interaction, most pointedly, the Buddha holding up a flower. Of course, if you want to make it into a scene, which I like to do, the way, if you study the Dharma and if you study the sutras, the scene that happens often at Vulture Peak is that this is where the Buddha would go with his disciples to teach and to practice. And so the way that the sutras usually go is that everybody's assembled and there's a noisy throng of bhikkhus and bhikkhunis. Those are male and female ordained, male and female lay people, and then of course there's all the spiritual beings that come, devas and garudas and mahorgas and rakshasas and all this kind of stuff. And I actually spoke to a guy who has been to Vulture Peak. You can go there, it's in India, and he said it's sort of like, 20 by 20, the top of Vulture Peak. So he's like, must have been really crowded. Anyways, and so the format would be that the Buddha would sort of arrange his seat, so prepare where he was going to sit, and he would usually sit in meditation for a period of time, and of course everyone would shut up because the Buddha was, and they would all bring themselves to the place. They would all be sitting in meditation, and then the Buddha would begin his talk. And so on this, and usually there would be, we do this ritual at the beginning of me giving a talk where the shika comes in and he does this bow to me, and then he does this thing with his cloth, touches it to his forehead, and that's symbolic actually of doing prostrations. And the form of that is that the head of the assembly would come to the Buddha and ask a question about something on behalf of the whole community, and the Buddha would respond to it, and that would be the talk. And so even today, when we do this form, that's what's supposed to be going on, because I'm not supposed to give a talk unless I'm asked a question. So the ceremony comes out where the shika comes and he's asking for a talk on behalf of the whole community. That's what that means. And this goes back to the time of the Buddha. So somebody in the community, a senior disciple, maybe Mahakasyapa, but it could be kind of anybody. It's sort of the inspiration came from the group. Somebody had a question. And then the Buddha would give a talk about it, a teaching about it. Sometimes there'd be questions afterwards. And so on this occasion, at the Vulture Peak, the Buddha, all of the normal stuff happened. The crowd assembles, the Buddha sits in his seat, everybody settles into meditation. The Buddha raises his eyes, everyone goes, oh, he's about to give a talk, and the Buddha just holds up a flower. And everyone sort of sits there going, okay, so he's going to say something about this. But he doesn't. He just holds the flower. And Mahakasyapa smiles. He grasps what the Buddha is pointing to in this teisho of a single gesture. And Shakyamuni, the Buddha, acknowledges that recognition has taken place. And in the Zen school, this is considered the first Dharma transmission. So when we chant the lineage chant, we've got Shakyamuni Buddha, and then we've got Mahakasyapa. He's considered the first ancestor, the first patriarch of the Zen school. Mysterious. I'm going to talk a little bit about Dharma transmission, but not yet. Next I want to talk about Ananda, because Ananda is the next ancestor. He's the second ancestor. And we have this same transmission story in the present case that we have, Mahakasyapa's flagpole. Ananda asked Mahakasyapa, the world-honored one transmitted the robe of gold brocade to you. What else did he transmit to you? So it said that when the Buddha transmitted this Dharma eye to Mahakasyapa, and upon his death, Mahakasyapa became the leader of the community, and the Buddha transmitted to him his robe, which was made of a gold fabric given to him by a king, and the bowl, his begging bowl. And for centuries, this was transmitted from ancestor to ancestor until the legend goes, the sixth patriarch in China. I always thought it would make a great Da Vinci Code kind of movie, the artifacts of the Buddha, Holy Grail quest or something like this. It's kind of the point of it, though. There's a wonderful fixation on the objects. And in many ways, this is what Ananda asks about. Ananda says to Mahakasyapa, the world-honored one transmitted the robe of gold brocade to you. What else did he transmit to you? So Ananda also has an interesting story. He is the Buddha, Siddhartha's cousin. And the sort of legend, the mythology goes that he was born on the day that Siddhartha had his great awakening. So he's 35 years younger than the Buddha. The Buddha died when he was 80 years old. So Ananda was young in the community, but he distinguished himself very early by the simple fact that he had flawless recall. He could remember absolutely everything to the last detail about anything that happened. Oh, hey, who said this and who said that? And it would be like the equivalent of a digital recorder in the Buddha's community. He was extremely smart, extremely clever, extremely brilliant in a lot of ways, and he had this perfect recall. But the way that he's portrayed, or the way that we come to understand Ananda, is that this brilliance, this conceptual brilliance, this excellence in intellect was actually an obstacle to his realization. And so while he was brilliant, he didn't really get it. He knew everything that the teachers were telling him. He would go, and the way that the Dharma was transmitted was that a new monk would go and practice with a group of monks whose practice was to recite a particular teaching of the Buddha. And you would go and practice with that group until you had committed that teaching to memory through chanting. And then you would go to the next group and learn the next teaching by memory. And so this is how the Dharma was transmitted. And Ananda was like, very quick, bang, know it, bang, know it, bang, know it. And he would go around and people would ask him to sort of clarify what was being taught, and he could recite it no problem. So among the monks, he was becoming very popular. But then he would go and meet with one of the generals, Shariputra or Moggallana or Mahakasyapa or his uncle Sid. And they would catch him every time, because they would have him recite something and then they would question him on what it was really all about, and he would stumble because he didn't get it. As the Buddha started to get older, in his 60s, late 50s, early 60s, the community realized that he was going to die eventually. And they thought, oh man, we really need to ensure that we can remember all of the stuff that the Buddha taught. Because you have to remember that the Buddha traveled a lot. So he would teach in one place with a community of monks that had established there, and then him and his entourage would sort of move to the next community of monastics, respond to questions there and teach, and then he would move to the next one. And so these communities of monks really got the what he was teaching there, but oftentimes they wouldn't always get what was being taught elsewhere. And so sometimes this would be transmitted by a monk, again, who was committed to memorizing and reciting what the Buddha had taught, going back to the other monastery. But then someone got wise and said, we got this guy who's kind of like a tape recorder. Oh, I guess they wouldn't have said that because they'd have to know what a tape recorder was. He has perfect recall. So what would make perfect sense is to just have this guy follow the Buddha around all the time. And so Ananda was the Buddha's attendant for the last 20 years of the Buddha's life. And he was with him everywhere that he went. And he often shared a room with the Buddha and was the sort of record keeper of the community. And oftentimes, if you look in the sutras, there will be an incident where there's another disciple of the Buddha talking about something that the Buddha taught, and he goes, "What did the Buddha say?" And Ananda goes, on, la 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 la, and off they go. So what happened after the Buddha died was that Mahakasyapa realized that there were these disparate groups of monks that had all received different teachings from the Buddha, and some of them had started to be varied. Anything that's happening with oral transmission, there's going to be changes. And so what would happen is he would get two monks together from two different communities and ask them to recite a teaching, and they would come out different. And he said, oh, this is not necessarily such a good thing. So we have to figure out how we're going to do this. So I'm going to call a council of the senior practitioners. We're going to take all of the teachings of the Buddha, and we're going to agree on the format and the wording of the texts, or I guess they weren't texts, the teachings, and going forward, these are the teachings that all of our community are going to learn and practice. And he said, and the requirement to attend this meeting is that is realization, is awakening, is liberation. You have to have realized this. You have to have awakened this. And so, arhat, you have to be an arhat to attend the council. And so all of these monks from all of these communities that had realized a great awakening were summoned forth to the first council. But there was a problem. Ananda said, so I'm imagining that you want me there. And Mahakasyapa said, well, no, because you haven't realized this. So Mahakasyapa said, there's still some time. Maybe if you go and just practice, go take care of the community, stop thinking about it so much, don't worry about it so much, and just do your practice, and maybe things will ripen. And so the story is that Mahakasyapa went and left off all of the chanting and all of the sort of traditional sort of stuff that he'd always done, and he was really messed up by being excluded, because it just made no sense. I remember everything that the Buddha taught. Why wouldn't they want me? I don't. And it said that he was raking. He was just doing some samu, some basic practice. And during this physical activity of samu, he had this realization. He had his great awakening. And then he went to talk to Mahakasyapa about it. And Mahakasyapa said, great! Oh, let's have you. So Ananda did show up at the first council. And if you look at any Buddhist scripture, the Buddhist scripture always begins with the words, thus have I heard. And the reason it begins with thus have I heard is because it is a record of Ananda speaking. They would say, what was the teaching? And he would say, thus have I heard. At such and such a time, we were in such and such a place, and these were the people who were there, and the question that was asked was this, and the Buddha said this, this, and this. And that's why they're structured the way that they are. It's all down to Ananda. So we have to remember Ananda for his wonderful qualities. We actually thank him every time we chant. I hope you all sort of catch that in the Hungry Ghost chant. We say, I always love it too, because it says, we honor Ananda the Arhat, the expounder of the Dharma. So it's like, he had his realization and he's the expounder of the Dharma, and we're so grateful for that guy and his wonderful memory. And one of the things about these characters, these wonderful Buddhist characters, is they are all of them, the Buddhas, the Bodhisattvas, the Arhats, the monks, they're all reflections of our own character. And Ananda is this wonderful personification of how we can get in our own way with our cleverness and our thinking mind. So Ananda has this interaction with Mahakasyapa. I only can imagine this is after the Buddha has died. And Ananda always, he's always kind of, he's often disparaged, and he's often kind of made fun of by people, I find, in the Zen school because of his intellect. The Zen school can really tend to inspire people to be sort of anti-intellectual. And so sometimes when you hear people in the Zen school talk about Ananda, it's with this derision. It's like, oh, Mr. Smarty Pants, but the thing I always hope we remember is that his intellect was an obstacle only insofar as it made it difficult for him to have a great realization. But when he had that great realization, that intellect was a powerful tool through which every generation of Buddhist practitioners has benefited greatly. In fact, we owe him everything. So I hope that we don't fall into this sort of like books are for chumps kind of thing, but recognize that the intellect, the cleverness, the memory, all of those skills, conceptual brilliance, are valuable, are made more valuable through realization. They can be an obstacle to realization, but they are powerful tools on the other side. Ananda asked Mahakasyapa, the world-honored one transmitted the robe of gold brocade to you. What else did he transmit to you? So, when we see transmission, when we see ceremonies, when we even when we're doing koan practice, we can get distracted, or we can get caught up in the externals of what's going on. When we come to take jukai, we can get caught up with, I get to, it's about manifesting in a new way in the community, and I get new robes, and I get a new name, and I get a sort of a thing around my neck. I hold a different position in the community, and I become a Buddhist, capital B. And I think that most of us certainly realize that, that's not the heart of it. But that's kind of, sometimes I think that's as deep as it goes, as we realize that that's not the heart of it. But if I were to say, so what's the heart of it then? Well, that becomes a more difficult thing to elucidate. And it certainly becomes, it's a more difficult thing to elucidate if we've never passed through that gate. It's all theory, it's all hypothesis, it's all guesswork. And I think the same goes when we are looking at something like ordination, or when we're talking about like the Osho ceremony, becoming an Osho, becoming a Zen teacher. Go ahead. Or if we're talking about what in our tradition is called Inka, or Dharma transmission. One of the things that struck me recently is about the word transmission. It's the translation that we use in English. I actually think it's pretty good as far as a word to translate a sort of ineffable transaction, I guess. But I think we misinterpret it because there's a couple of ways that we can understand the word transmission. So I think that when most of us who have been practicing for some time hear transmission, and we hear about Dharma transmission, we hear about a teacher transmitting to a student, I think the transmission that we kind of get in our head is like a disease transmission, actually. It's like I have this disease, this Dharma disease, and I've been practicing in close proximity with my student, and now my student has this Dharma disease. And actually, I think that it's really good for us to understand that we see things this way, because sometimes I've seen it a lot in spiritual communities and with spiritual teachers, that there really is a belief in a sort of enlightenment through proximity. I've seen lots of spiritual teachers who come into a room and people who, if you've been practicing in that community and you're at all the sits and you do all the sessions, and it's like there's suddenly the teacher comes in and there's this group of people who you've never seen on a cushion before in your entire life, and they are pushing themselves to the front of the room to be as close to the teacher as possible because, I don't know, they think that they're going to catch it somehow. They're going to catch the transmission. But I don't think that that's how it works. That certainly hasn't been my experience of it. When I was a little bit younger, this woman came to the Zen Center, and she had been diagnosed with a brain tumor. And she realized that she needed to, or she wanted to attend to, she had some time, and she realized that she wanted to attend to her sort of internal world, and she began practice with us. And she kind of got into it as quickly as she could, and as deeply as she could, in concert with the assertion of the symptoms that were arising as a result of her brain tumor. And when she couldn't come anymore, I started going to visit her at her home. And as her illness progressed, it got to the point where they had this lovely home, and they sort of set her bed up in the front room. And I remember I would go in and visit her, and I would talk to her for a little while. And as her illness progressed, at a certain point, she didn't talk anymore. But I would go and visit her and hold her hand and talk to her and just sit with her, just be still with her. And often I would go, and there would be this jazz music. They had this great stereo, and there would be this jazz music playing. And I've always liked jazz, but before then, I had never really taken the time to sort of listen to it. I was way too serious about Zen. And so I would go into this space, and sometimes I would show up, and her husband would be like, "Oh, I'll turn off the music," and then she would respond, and clearly saying like, "No, I want to have the music." So I would listen, and we would create this space of stillness and silence, and we would listen to this fantastic jazz on a really great stereo. And eventually I sort of said, like, it was so varied and so, just varied, that I said to her husband, I was like, is this a collection or what is this? And he said, oh, no, it's KPLU. It's this radio station in Seattle. And I was like, oh, wow. So I started listening to KPLU, and I still to this day, generally, KPLU is one of my, it's public radio, it's from Seattle, and it's just a lot of jazz and blues. So in my car, if I'm driving around, I'm listening to music, 9 times out of 10, it's KPLU or the Silmarillion on CD. So, anyways, so the reason that I'm talking about this is the way I think it's easiest to understand transmission is like a radio transmitter that is sort of the mother of all transmitters, is the origin of the cosmos itself. And our practice in Zen is simply to tune ourselves, to tune our radios to this master signal. So one of the things that I've noticed with KPLU is they actually have an antenna in Victoria, sort of like a relay in Victoria. And as I drive around, living out here, it's kind of a little bit scratchy out here in Souk. And then if I drive into Langford and I go left on Jacqueline Road, there's a section from like Kelly Road to Station Street where that huge transformer is, where it just like totally cuts out. Can't hear it at all. And then once you get past station, it comes back in. If you're going over the Malahat, you can get sort of to the top of the Malahat, and then once you go over, it disappears again. And the reason I wanted to talk about this is that each of us has a relationship with this Dharma activity, and our awareness of the Dharma activity, it's always there. The signal's always there. But there are innumerable distractions and things that come up louder in our lives. There are things that we can, if we get bored with the signal, we'll change the station and listen to something else for a while. And my experience of Dharma practice and Dharma transmission is much closer to this kind of transmission. When we meet a teacher, I think that maybe we can say that the Dharma activity is like the origin from which music comes. Before music, before it's jazz, or before it's classical, or before it's new music, it arises. And as it is realized and seen and known by human beings, it becomes music, and it becomes art, and it becomes all these innumerable things. And in Zen centers, these human beings who tune in to the Dharma activity become teachers. Maybe each school, we could say, of Buddhism is like a particular radio station. Mm-hmm. So we have, maybe the Zen school is like the jazz station or something like this. Mm-hmm. Each of us as practitioners, each of us as listeners, we can be traveling along in our lives, and maybe our practices is becoming more consistent, a little bit deeper. Maybe we're taking the time to really reflect on our actions and their fruits. And we begin in little ways, in little interactions and things that we're seeing and experiencing. We're beginning to hear the sound of the cosmos through what's being transmitted. We might be listening to the jazz music, but the jazz music we can experience as just a conduit, just a carrier of the original transmission, that original inspiration, that light or that love or that whatever it is that is before the words we can put on it. So the way I like to think about it is when we put external, we talk about external transmission. I like to think about it as like the antenna that's in Victoria. It's not the source of the sound. In fact, even the record or the main broadcasting station is actually, when we look at it, it's not the original source of that music. It's been met with and embodied and expressed. And we meet with the origin through these conduits of transmission. And as we go through our lives, there's periods where the signal is crystal clear and we can be moved by the emotion of the person who is performing the music. We're moved by it because they're moved by the source, by the origin. But unlike a disease transmission, it's not like a one-time thing. It's not like, the teacher transmitted to the student and now there's, it's like they're perfectly diseased with enlightenment or something like this. One of my favorite things that happens, it's KPLU is an NPR station, and so there's some wonderful things that happen. One of my favorites is the announcer will say, "And now we'll go to Sprince Arbogast for the traffic report. Over to you, Sprince." And there's this space. Sprince is at the bathroom, or she's not there. And then, "Okay, well, we'll come back to Sprince in just a minute." And I think that this is the case with transmission as well, with anybody who is transmitting, or anybody who is an intermediary, I guess, between sort of the experience of the source and you as the person who's listening. And we can, as listeners, we can hear what's being broadcast. If we're distracted or there's an obstruction, we might mishear what's being broadcast. But it will inspire us when we tune it in clearly, or when we pay attention, or when we're in a place with a clear signal from our listening ear to the transmission station, to the broadcaster, to the artist, and to the origin, the source. This is transmission. So whenever I used to be a big believer in disease, the Dharma disease form of transmission. But now I really look at it like Dharma transmission is kind of like getting a permit to set up a radio antenna of your own in a particular place. You become a station manager. And the signal is not originally yours, and the music is not originally yours, and certainly the origin is no more yours than it is anybody else's. But you have permission to project, to express that jazz. And it's wonderful. But just like listening to jazz music or listening to whatever kind of music that you like, and it can move us, it's important to recognize also that any station can have technical difficulties. And any station, no matter how wonderful the signal is, even satellites, the signal can be interrupted. We can be distracted by other things. There can be interference in receiving that signal. So oftentimes these days, and I think it's not just these days, it's always been the case, people are disappointed by teachers, people who have received Dharma transmission. But mostly, in my opinion, I think it's because of the way that we view Dharma transmission. Because we find it unbelievable that if this person has actually caught the awakening enlightenment disease, how could they behave in a way that was unenlightened? But I think that if we view this as transmission like a signal, it seems completely plausible that someone might be away from the big red switch. Someone might be obstructed or distracted. And I think, again, what is most important to understand is that listening to beautiful music can be inspiring. Looking at beautiful art can be inspiring. We can be touched by the origin through the work of other people, through the words of other people, through the music of other people. But if we're practicing Dharma, we really have to understand that that's not the point. Sasaki Roshi gave this teisho one time, I'll never forget, that we were in a sesshin, and there was a whole bunch of people there who were Tuina massage practitioners and Qigong masters and Reiki masters, and they kept requesting meetings with him about talking about the Dharma and Zen and how it applied to all of these things. And he came out, Sasaki Roshi, all the things that, he was just notorious for being acerbic. I think he must have, even as a child, he must have come across as an old, cranky man. And he gave this teisho where he said, basically, he said, you people all come here and you want to talk to me about appliances. He said, you want to talk about which is the best toaster, and which is the best blender, and which is the best, appliance. And he said, Zen practice, all I want for you is to stick your finger in the socket and understand the source that from which all of these appliances are propelled or powered. And one of the things that I think we chant every day is the last teaching of Siddhartha before he died. No. You are the light itself. Rely on yourself. Do not rely on others. The Dharma is the light. Rely on the Dharma. Do not rely on anything else other than the Dharma. That's Atta Dipa that we chant, the first chant that we do. So just like listening to a radio station or seeing art, don't be distracted by the form that the embodied realization takes. Don't be distracted by the music. Don't be distracted by the beauty of the external form, or by the cleverness and brilliance and rhythmicness and rhyme of the words. Our practice in Zen is to follow the transmission to the source. This is why in the Zen Center, many people over the 20 plus years that I've been here have talked about the Zen Center should start programs in art, or the Zen Center should do something in music, or we should get something involved in social activism, or we should care about the homeless people, or all of this kind of stuff. And I've always been no. These are the business of human beings. And if you want to follow those pursuits, if you want to practice music, or you want to practice sume, Japanese painting, or you want to practice oils, or you want to make jazz, or you want to do new music, make that your expression of the transmission from the origin. Don't copy people, and don't impose that on other people around you because you've mistaken it as the way of practice. Realize the origin. Stick your finger in the socket and know the source yourself. And this is the practice that we engage in. So, thank you for your patience and your leg power. So, Ananda asked Mahakasyapa, the world-honored one transmitted the robe of gold brocade to you. What else did he transmit to you? Now, this is a wonderful question, both because he's asking about the toaster, but there's clearly an awareness that there's something else going on. Ananda knows that there's something else going on. He's been hanging out with the Buddha for years and years, more than 20 years. So clearly he knows something's going on. He's seen people have realization and the transformation that has taken in their lives. So he knows that something's going on. So he asks Mahakasyapa, what else did he transmit? Kasyapa says, Ananda! And Ananda answers, yes! And there's no space of thought in between. which for Ananda is remarkable. There is a direct call and a direct response, and there is nothing in between. There is an intimacy between them. We have, this in many ways, we could say, like, this is the origin of Rinzai's shout. Ananda! Yes! There's no jump. It's just this immediate response. Kasyapa says, knock down the flagpole at the gate. So in olden times, when a teacher was going to give a teisho, when the teacher was going to give a teaching, they would hoist this flag to sort of say it's open for business, and people could come in and hear the teacher's talk, hopefully have some kind of awakening as a result of this talk, and then ask questions or have the experience of a teaching, a Dharma teaching. And so Kasyapa says, knock down the flagpole. Lesson over. And I think particularly for Mahakasyapa, dealing with Ananda, and certainly it's been instructed to me, and it's been my experience, that if you are dealing with somebody who comes totally intellectually, completely conceptually, sometimes one of the best ways to interact with that person is non-conceptually. I say sometimes, because sometimes it's totally futile. Sometimes someone will ask you a question, you'll give what you think is a beautiful demonstration, and they're still like, they think you coughed or something, and they're still waiting for the explanation. So anyway, what is... Oh... Mm. And when I first started training, and certainly in the Japanese format, that was how I was taught to deal with intellection of any kind. When I first came to the Zen Center, I asked the person who was the teacher at the time, Eshu, about what does this ring mean? Where does it come from? Is there some symbolism? And he said, I don't know. I have no idea. And at the time, I thought he was an idiot. Some kind of religious zealot that just did whatever he was told. The more I practiced with him, I realized I don't think he was an idiot or a zealot. I think that I was too intellectual, and he was responding in the traditional way. That's the way that it was traditionally done. But what I also realized from my own side was that it certainly didn't cut anything off. I didn't stop asking about it. I just went and pursued the answer on my own time. And the internet was around, and I could Google stuff, and I busied myself that way. So sometimes I think it's also helpful to allow that intellection to go to its natural conclusion, because essentially the origin, this source, is outside, as it says here in case 6, it's outside of intellection. So you can think about it all you want, and I'm sure that that's what happened with Ananda, is he thought about it all he could. He's the best thinker around, and he still couldn't get there. I have manifested the true Dharma I, the marvelous mind of nirvana, cessation, reality itself as simultaneously form and formlessness, and the subtle Dharma, which can never be realized by relying on words alone and is transmitted without dependence on scripture or doctrine. Knock the flagpole down, just this simple interaction. Wumen says, if you can give a turning word that is intimate to this case, then you will see that the meeting at Mount Gudrakuta, Vulture Peak, is still vigorously in session. So, Muman is saying, if you can demonstrate, it doesn't have to be words, if you can demonstrate, if you can embody, if you can express this sound or this signal that is arising from the origin in your own words, with your own body in this moment, then you too are intimate. You are an intimate of Ananda. You are an intimate of Mahakasyapa. And this moment, the raising of the flower, the smiling of Mahakasyapa, the calling of Mahakasyapa, the responding of Ananda, it's like if you can respond intimately, these events are skewered through in the present moment, right here and right now. The meeting at Mount Gudrakuta has never ended, and we are living it today. If you can't, well, Vipassana Buddha, who has been striving from earliest times, has not attained true subtlety. So Vipassana, when we chant the whole Dharma lineage, there's 7 legendary Buddhas that happened before Shakyamuni, and he is the first. And so what Muman is saying, if you can't respond, if you can't, stick your finger into the socket in this moment, then even that first Buddha is just a dry turd. You can set him up on an altar and you can bow to him, but there's no life in it. There's no connection to you in this present moment, and you're just Wu Men's verse says, "The call is good, the answer is intimate. How many discuss this with glaring eyes?" And this reminded me of, I used to really like boxing, watching boxing matches. Or I guess many people watch, ultimate fighting and stuff. Sumo wrestling is another one that I've seen people really get into. But it can be anything, debate. I think boxing matches are a good example. Martial arts matches are a good example. Fencing. Arguments are really good. Because there is a reality that's taking place in an interaction, a charged interaction like that. Music, I think, is another one. Making improvisational jazz or something like this. You have to be completely present in those interactions. You're not reflecting on what happened in the breath before, the second before, and you're not worried about what's coming up next. All that's happening is right here. And what happens is that interaction happens. Sumo is a great example because it's fast and it's really brief, and there's a bunch of stuff that happens around it. And then once the match begins, the two forces meet, and the interaction is very quick, and the result is instantaneous. And there's no thought about that. But what we have afterwards is commentators. Mostly people who don't do that thing, talking about the merits of each person's activity and the move that the person used and the training that the person had and what they've been eating for breakfast and every aspect of all of this stuff that's happening around it. And it's not false. It's absolutely true. And it's absolutely accurate. We can watch the slow motion replay and we can go over it again and again and again. But if you talk to the people who interacted in that transaction, they kind of will look at you funny because you've spent 30 minutes talking about a 10-second transaction, and you've come nowhere near touching what happened in that moment. And so this is what Wumen is pointing to here. He's looking at us, and particularly me, as please, adjust yourself so you're comfortable, take your legs out or whatever. This is what he's talking about, is me. The call is good, the answer is intimate. Ananda, yes. That should be enough. How many discuss this with glaring eyes? Well, at least Eshu does for an hour. Zen people all over the world for centuries have been talking about this kind of interaction. Get really excited. No, Ananda was the awakening. Oh, Mahakasyapa. No, Ananda was a... And this is what Wumen is pointing to. The call is good. The answer is intimate. How many discuss this with glaring eyes? Elder brother calls, younger brother answers. The family disgrace. So, what Wumen is pointing to here is that this interaction, this simple interaction between Mahakasyapa and Ananda, is the whole activity of the school of Zen. It's the whole thing, the dynamism of that activity. Another way of really translating this, Wumen has a sort of irony in his commentary, in his verse sometimes, but essentially you can just say it's like this case is exposing the family secret. The stuff that we can't talk about that goes on in our school, not because it's like a shameful thing, but actually because you can't talk about it. It's just this case is like someone looking in our window. You can see what's going on here just so easily. The last line of the verse says, there is a spring that does not belong to yin and yang. And again, this is another translation that I think is wonderful, and it presents a possibility in English that I think is consistent with what it's saying. Essentially, this comes from the Chinese idea that the seasons that we experience are, and the transition in seasons is based on the interaction of these two activities of yin and yang, which are, sometimes they're expressed as like light and dark, or male and female, or active and passive. But essentially, what it's pointing to is that there are, in the seasons, there are forces at play that bring those things into causation, or into manifestation. And Wumen is saying there is a spring, there's a season that isn't reliant on this. And I think another way that the word spring offers is, to me, in particularly connected to what I've been talking about today, is I think of it like a bubbling spring, like a source of water coming up out of the ground, or a source of inspiration, a source of life, a source of activity, a source of movement. And it's not reliant on musical notes, and it's not reliant on our words, and it's not reliant on any kind of medium. It's not reliant on a container. This spring is shunyata. It is the origin of all things in this cosmos, and that's what Wumen is pointing to with this verse. That's the family business. Not describing that source, but in recognizing that we are not separate from that source. We are nothing other than that source. And in manifesting that directly, without a relay tower, without a broadcaster, without an interpretation in between, coming to know that spring for ourselves. Okay, knock down the flagpole. Thanks for listening to the Living Zen podcast. If you follow Living Zen through iTunes, I would very much appreciate it if you would take a moment to let me know what you think about it by rating or reviewing the podcast, so that new listeners can also hear what you have to say. Thank you for your time and for your support.